note, because I had brought up in previous classes that um, the conflict sometimes between characters, between like Moses and Pharaoh, and um, at other occasions it's judges with the people, or like Samuel with the people, and those kinds of things. But in other places like this one, it's the character with their context. And we didn't necessarily do this for Abraham, but that's where the character Abraham, where the conflict arises, is between him and his circumstances of being old, his wife being barren, him having to go out into a land that they have no descendants to be able to hand all these things off to. And so, again, the challenge posed to Abraham there provides the means of the conflict. And so, you could think of any story that involves a hero. Oftentimes, there's a foil. If you, again, you could think, we were just watching Avengers Endgame last night again. So again, Thanos, he's the bad guy. That's the foil. But then there's also all these little issues that you have, like with Hawkeye. I was about to call him Hawkman. Hawkeye. That again, part of what he's dealing with is his circumstances of having lost his wife, having lost the kids, and so again, he's having to battle against those kinds of things. Same thing happens with Hulk. So again, his condition, his set of circumstances provides an additional layer to what's going on between the characters, and so, or the conflict between the foil and the characters. So, and so just paying attention to some of those things. And so, again, it's nothing you guys haven't seen before. And so again, but just kind of being aware of, oh, okay, that's what's going on. And so, any questions, thoughts? Also, when my wife always gets on me about falling asleep, because I fall asleep during movies. Yeah, I couldn't hang for 3 hours in that movie. I think we watched it at night too, and that doesn't help. So I'm a 33-year-old old man. If you put me in front of a TV for long enough, I'm gonna fall asleep. Like I think that's probably why I'm more prone to watching sports, because at least like it's changing and it's like something's always happening or something dramatic. Unless it's baseball, then I'm always going to fall asleep, but that's probably just more comfort. I did that when I was growing up too. So some things you never lose. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into it for this morning then. Oh, we got a question here. Because the movie's bored, or you were just tired? Probably a little bit of both. I think I think it came out like in the middle of the semester, and anytime mid-semester, I'm going to be tired. It doesn't really matter. Like I said, why did Christian Vega? That's right. Yeah, the movie's not boring, but definitely not boring. There's a lot of action happening, but yeah, it's not you, it's me. One of those kinds of deals. It's not the movie, it's me. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get into it for this morning. So we've talked through the first two acts of Scripture, or the main acts of the Bible, where God establishes his kingdom with creation and then rebellion in the kingdom. And it's good to note the language that is being used here, specifically in regards to kingdom, as you're not a king without a kingdom, and every kingdom needs a king. And so with creation, God's establishing his kingdom, and you have rebellion there with Adam and Eve, which we've talked about over the past couple of classes, with what's happening in Numbers and how those things kind of keep on persisting throughout the story. And so much that it goes through Act 3, where the king's going to choose Israel. He initiates redemption for the people, in that the king is choosing a people to dwell in the land, which brings up notes of Abrahamic covenant and the 3 Ps. Do you guys remember what the 3 Ps are? Sorry, I'm moving some things around to kind of get my camera up a little higher. You guys remember what the 3 Ps are?
People, place, and presence.
Hey, there you go. Nice. Descendants, a bunch of babies running around. Place, the land of Canaan, and then presence, God, I will be their God and they will be my people. Perfect. And so what God is going to then do is settle the people down into a land, which we'll get into here, because their settling into a land will be problematic in so many different ways. And we'll talk about that when we talk about kingship. In Act 4, coming to the king, redemption is accomplished. Act 5, spreading the news of the king, which is going to, from Jerusalem to Rome and into all the world, and then return of the king, redemption is completed. And just as a quick heads up, this all is on Moodle. If you're wondering where this PowerPoint is at, you'll see it there on week 5. So we've covered from the start of the story here in Eden and how it kind of crash lands straight into Noah. It picks back up here with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the covenant God creates with Abraham and repeats with Isaac and then repeats again with Jacob. Now, this kind of threefold repetition that guarantees that God will bring these things to pass. He's going to make it happen. And so the people, after a famine, go down into Egypt with Joseph, who's been sent down there because of his brothers. And they're going to continue on through Exodus and the desert wanderings. After they're delivered, they wander around, which we talked about, a day for every year, or every year for a day that they brought back a report. So flip it. We talked last class with this Joshua and the Conquest, era of the Judges. And what we're going to get to today, we may get to Saul, we probably may, maybe not. We'll talk about Samuel and then Saul and David Friday. A few things to note that I didn't bring up last class, again, for the sake of time, is to be able to take note of what's happening in specific regards to Tabernacle. Again, some fun pictures for us to see, especially as it relates to the wandering period. This is the tent that they have in their midst of the tabernacle here. That this is what's going around as they're traveling. And again, that the people would be surrounded over here, kind of in the way that it's laid out. I'll have to bring in another picture, but in the way that it's laid out, it's that it goes north, south, east, west. And with the layout, what it reflects is the way that Israel will be laid out later on in the promised land. And so you have Dan in the north, Judah in the south, and then you have everybody kind of scattered around. Like, again, the way everything's pieced out is the way that each, I don't want to call it a state, but the way each tribe is being laid out. So the way that it's being portrayed, especially in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and as the people settle down into the land, is as a military camp, which is going to be really important to note as we talk about what are the reasons why a people want a king. That the initial layout is as a military camp with the general in the middle and all the people, the military kind of surrounding that, the general or the kind of camp in the middle. And again, it's going to be important to note, especially as we talk about why Israel wants a king, to remember this and keep this in mind. And so again, these are just digging a little more into what was inside the tabernacle. You see here what's going on between the Ark of the Covenant and with the seraphim that are on the top, or the cherubim that are on top. You have a lampstand here, which is meant to reflect a tree. You have the altar and the incense, and again, table of bread. You have the holy place and the most holy place. And this is kind of a zoom in view of the ark. This is what's in the ark. You have the 2 tablets, as well as a couple of elements from Moses, specifically his staff. You kind of see how it budded, and that's how, and when God made the staff bud. Hey, bud. And here is kind of an artist's reconstruction of what the temple would look like. It was about 3 stories high, something like, I believe it was about 1.5 football fields long, between 1.5 to 2 football fields long. Again, that thing's massive, 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 massive. But again, this is the prototype, and this is what it's meant to look like. Especially when God comes to dwell with the people later on with Solomon. And so you get this idea of what's happening here, with entering into this place where the priest would be at, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies where the high priests enter once a year. And should the high priest have any sins, dead, gone. And so one thing we've seen so far is that one continuous story of Israel's faithfulness or unfaithfulness to the covenant. And again, you could think constitution, especially as it stands between a king and his peoples, laid out between Israel themselves And then God in Deuteronomy, again, with the second generation committing themselves to do all the things that are written in the book of the law or Torah. Again, it's kind of this restart with this new generation that are now settling into the land. But what happens in Judges, again, as the people find themselves not so much in all two different situations of what happens, because again, what manifests itself in Judges is the issue of idolatry. The issue of idolatry. And as Samuel picks up the story, it's not creating a different story as much as it is building off a pre-existing condition. And so the way Samuel will start out is that Samuel does serve as Israel's last judge, but then also as the first prophet and priest, the kind of the dual role that Samuel has with the two. And one of the questions that Samuel will ask and wrestle with as a whole, and not necessarily he's going to state this in so many words, but the issue that Samuel brings up for us is, should Israel even have a king in the first place, because of what unfolds with Samuel, specifically in regards to monarchy and the development of monarchy in Israel. That Samuel, in the book of Samuel, will address whether or not Israel should have a king and the development and issues that come along with having a king, which we'll dig into right now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go into breakout groups, and I'm going to post this in the questions. I believe it's for Samuel 1 through, I believe it's 17, but let me double check that for you guys really quick. But you guys, what you guys are going to do, you guys are going to talk about this. And again, take a look at the passages and don't be thrown off by when you see the kind of dual images that come up in the text. Let the tensions be tense, but when they're there, try to explain yes, but this, no, but that, well, kind of this, kind of that. One of Partita's Jedi mind tricks is to always give A or B answers, and some 99.9% of the time, if you've taken me before, there's always a third option. There's always a third option, a fourth option, fifth option. Should we choose again to think about it a little differently, a little more creatively. So as you guys are digging through this text again, think through some of the different options that are being provided and why that might be. Again, is it God being an idealist and him just thinking that, well, maybe we can try to make this work and maybe we can make something happen? Or is it in reality, well, the people they can't handle the truth. They can't handle a king, so they need something else. Or again, is it somewhere something else that's happening in the text? So we're going to go ahead and get into breakout groups, and then we'll get back together, talk about it, be about it. To be about it. Does Yahweh want Israel to have a king or not? Does Yahweh want Israel to have a king or not? All right, a few of you are shaking your heads, a few of you are nodding your heads. Talk about it, be about
it. I think
go ahead, Art.
Oh, well, I didn't get to read it, but I know I read it before in the past. I know that that they were asking for a king, right? Correct, if I'm correct. And I know that God said, like, well, because God was supposed to lead them with the cloud. He was supposed to lead them, but they said other nations had kings, and so they were looking for a man to be in place and to follow man, which is by nature kind of like what people do in a sense. And God was saying, like, well, I'm your king, and so He did that. He did that so that way they could, kind of be satisfied in a sense. But initially, it was supposed to be God leading them all the way.
Yep. Yeah. But what reasons are there that Israel asked for a king? They say that they want to be like other nations, but there's one specific thing that they're kind of looking for.
Didn't they want someone to like lead them into battle?
Exactly. And what's the problem with that? Think
Because then
Joshua.
God didn't leave them into battle like he did with Joshua and everybody else. God's not the one in charge. It becomes the new king.
Exactly. So what is it that they're actually asking for and asking for a king?
A human ruler. They want to trust in a human more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But just think even more human need than that. A basic human need.
Is it something they can see? They want something they
Yeah.
can see.
Yeah, there's definitely something in having this kind of somebody tangible to lead them and to have somebody over them, but there's also something else more primal than that as a kind of basic human need. That's what we're all looking for.
Is it protection?
Protection or security, to be safe. Because again, you have this group of formerly nomadic people that are now dwelling in the land surrounded by who they perceive to be enemies. And so their thought is that, hey, give us a king and we will be secure because there will be somebody who will lead us into military battle. But that, as Eden brought up, that kind of flies in the face of Joshua because of what the link is between obedience and then success, or military success, as we would call it. Because that was guaranteed through keeping covenant or keeping Torah. And so again, this desire for a king is brought up because again, while yes, it is, they want to be like other nations, but most specifically, it's kind of like when you have like little kids that kind of give you a preliminary thing, like if they want a snack or they want to go somewhere, they're like, oh, I want to, just because I want to go outside. And then you find out, oh, they actually want to go hang out with their friends. And so there's kind of like these secondary reasons that are actually the driving reasons. And so for Israel, that's kind of the same way where there's this driving desire for security that comes by way of having somebody to lead them. And so again, we have this kind of turnover, which is what only makes that passage in 1 Samuel 8 all the more tragic of what's happening in this kind of rejection of Yahweh as king. And so that kind of brings us back to the first question is, was Israel meant to have a king? I promise it's not a trick question.
No. Or yes, but it was not supposed to be a human king.
There you go. There you go. Like, yeah, because we've been talking about this whole time since the story got started that Yahweh's been the king. And that's going to continue to be the through line, and that's been the through line from Genesis as we're now arriving into Samuel, and what's going to consistently be the pattern, especially as we start talking about Saul, David, and Solomon. Because usually David gets taken to be the poster boy, which in a lot of ways he is, and we'll talk about why that is. But still of what Genesis, what's been pointed out from Genesis all the way through Samuel, and the way that the text is trying to point us back to Yahweh as king. That's already been consistent in the story since the story's begun. But as far as it goes with having a human ruler, is Israel meant to have a human king? That's the other question. And that's up for debate. Because you'll see in what came up in Deuteronomy.
He sets parameters, like if they do have a king, what are some things that they should follow?
Yeah, what are some of the parameters?
He has to be from Israel, can't be foreign or from a foreign nation.
Yep. And what else? Anybody else? Either Taylor or anybody else?
He must not take many wives.
Who does that sound like?
Solomon.
Mm-hmm. And what
Another
else?
parameter says he shall not multiply horses for himself or cause you to return to Egypt to multiply horses.
Yep. And just kind of off the top of your head, if you know this, extra brownie points for today. If not, no worries. What's the big deal about horses other than them just being generally beautiful animals?
Military presence?
Hey, there you go, Taylor. That in the Bible again and again in the prophets, and here that there's a link between military strength and having a lot of horses, because that's what you would go into battle with. And so the acquisition of a lot of horses, again, Solomon's not just trying to build a stable to have a lot of pretty ponies to ride around on. But again, it's the acquisition and the demonstration of military strength, which again, that's the people's desire, is for somebody to lead them in battle. And so you have this dual imagery between the people having a king or wanting a king to provide security, but hey, don't do those things which would, at least on the surface, give you the appearance that we are now a secure people because of all the weapons we have, or because of all the armaments we now have in our trunk over here. And so, again, that there's still a call back, even in the midst of all this, of faithfulness to Yahweh, in the context of what would look like it's kind of apart from covenant. Like, covenant has everything to do with what's going on here, especially as it goes with what are now going to be the expectations put on the king. Because what's another expectation? That's what one of the last ones.
He should write a book of the copied law approved by the Levitical priests.
He's going to be a student. He's going to be a dude about the books. He's going to be a book nerd. Bookworm. Book nerd. He's going to be a bookworm. He's going to be studying. He's going to be learning. He's going to know Torah. Why? Because of one of the jobs, if not the job that the king has, and to lead the people into covenant faithfulness. And so, in reality of what's happening here, of what's being projected, is between ideal and reality. Between ideal and reality of Yahweh being the king over the people, but yet Yahweh condescending to the people's needs and the people's demands and working with those expectations and desires. Essentially, God meeting people where they're at. The people want a king? Okay. Well, you guys are going to have these parameters and work these kinds of things out in order to best maintain those conditions. And when the kings don't do it, that's when things go way, 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 way south, which we see happen more often than not. But when the kings do what they're supposed to do, it goes well with the people, which again isn't meant to be a kind of, it's not meant to be a paradox, but yet is frequently because of the patterns that the kings take. And so again, caught up between ideal and reality, Yahweh condescends, bends down to the people's desires and meets them where they're at, which again happens frequently. It happens in covenant, with Yahweh creating covenant. It happens in the wilderness, and it happens here again with giving them a king. Because again, in Deuteronomy, God says, I'm going to choose who the king is. And so here the people were allowed to, hey, all right, go and pick your king. And who do they pick? They pick Saul. And based on his credentials, it would seem that they made a wise choice, but maybe not so much because of the issues that then arise. And so you see here on the PowerPoint that in one important sense, that Israel doesn't need a king because Yahweh is already the king. But yet there's still this need for somebody to lead the people into their vocation as kings and priests, queens and priestesses. There's the need for somebody to lead them into covenant faithfulness. And so the book of Samuel will wrestle with these questions. But as Samuel starts out, you have these dual characters, one being Hannah and the other being the nation of Israel as a whole. And the conditions and state of each character will reflect in some part one another. Where you have Hannah, who is barren, unable to have a child, to fulfill what would be her, what we'd say her obligation or female obligations for the time period. And a lot of cultures, it's similar. That there's an expectation, especially as a married woman, that immediately you just start pumping out babies. Yeah, me and my wife being Hispanic, that's the question. We've got every single family get together, every single birthday party. When are you guys gonna have babies? When are you guys gonna have kids? Are you guys planning on having kids yet? You guys talked about having kids, so it's just it's not one that has died and gone away. So again, so that being said, that what Hannah reflects a lot of is what's going to be going on with Israel. There's a lack of security because she's unable to have a child. She's also dealing with the social stigma that Israel too, again, being caught up in a kind of downward spiral, not producing in the way that they ought to. The land doesn't have rest. The people don't have rest. And the presence of God being neglected and disregarded. And this is most specific in regards to what's happening here is with the covenant being the ark being used as a kind of good luck charm against the Philistines. Again, the thought that because God is with us, this automatically grants us every right to just do whatever we want and then expect to be victorious in battle, which isn't the case. And so I'm not going to go too much about here, but it does bring up the point between public and personal, that what's happening to Hannah in private is reflected in the way that the nation carries out their own, not just spirituality, but the way that their covenant faithfulness is not being demonstrated in public. And so the Ark of the Covenant is removed from Israel, surrounded by enemies, that the land in Hannah's womb won't produce, that the land, again, is marked by unrest. There's no peace. Yet in the midst of it, we do have grace. We do have grace that, again, that with the ark wreaking havoc in the midst of the Philistines and the land of the Philistines, that you have the kind of grace there, that the ark is given back without a fight. And that God opens Hannah's womb and gives her a son. And again, mind you, this is in the midst of, again, Israel's continuing her downward spiral, and yet God is still giving barren women a son, and God is still demonstrating his presence with the people through what's happening with the Philistines. And so that son that God gives to Hannah, baby Sammy, he's a Nazarite like Samson, but he's genuine. He's faithful. Him and Samson got very little in common, but one of the things that they are marked by is their kind of differentiation from the people. In so much that there's a quote that he stands for God in the midst of a society that's forgotten how, and he's tough as nails, and that Samuel will provide the kind of bridge between the judges and the prophets. That Samuel has this distinction of being marked as a character that God doesn't let his words fall to the ground, meaning that both because of the integrity of his life, but then also because of his faithfulness, that his words are then reliable. Sorry. And so Samuel anoints the first two kings, but then also provides a check on their royal ambitions. This is important to bring up for prophets, because what Samuel will serve as the prototype for the prophets, and that the prophets don't do fortune telling. The prophets don't do fortune telling. The prophets don't do fortune telling. What they do is that they provide the kind of checks and balances for the monarchy. That the prophets provide checks and balances for the monarchy. And the way that they do that is reminding them of their Torah obligations of keeping covenant. It's a lot more of calling back to covenant, more so than it is just saying what's going to happen in the future. That there is some of that, but again, everything is predicated on what is marked out already in the covenant. And so when you have, like in places like in Isaiah, in places what's happening in Jeremiah, that where you have this pronouncement of judgment that's coming, a lot of it reflects what's already been marked out in Deuteronomy with covenantal curses of what happens with breaking covenant. And then when you see these images come back of either a king returning or establishing a kingdom. Again, it's calling back to original, calling back to creation and the reestablishment of God as king over the people. And so again, so much of what the prophets do is to remind the monarchy about their obligations to who their king actually is, which is Yahweh. And so what Samuel will also do is provide for us a kind of theology of kingship that I brought this up before, but to bring it up here again, that the Yahweh is the one who chooses the king. We see that in Deuteronomy 17. That the king is anointed and becomes Yahweh's anointed one. That usually what you do is you take a big jar of oil and that would be dumped on the king's head and it would just smother them in oil. He'd be endowed with Yahweh's spirit. Again, that word to anoint comes from the word, the anointed one, Mashiach, comes from the Hebrew word Mashah, which means to either to douse or to submerge. It's a lot, somewhat has nuances of baptism connected to it, but not necessarily exact. But again, the idea is to be kind of doused in with this thing. But what ends up, again, representative of the oil is the Holy Spirit. Representative of the Spirit is the oil. And so after these kinds of things, dripping with oil, that the mortal king is set up as the kind of vice royal to rule under Yahweh's care. That, and again, the one job that they have to do is to lead Israel in covenant faithfulness. The one job they have to do, lead Israel in covenant faithfulness. That's it. Job description, sign on the dotted line. And so you kind of get, just an aside there, you have the Hebrew word for anointed one is Mashiach, Messiah, the Christ in Greek. And so you kind of start seeing how these things start kind of forming in Hebrew imagination when Jesus starts to come on the scene. And why this expectation later on happens when Jesus doesn't come in and start taking out all these pagan Romans. And why when the questions come up from people like James and John is when you're going to come to establish your kingdom, or hey, when you come back, when are you going to put us at your right hand and at your left? Because again, there's this thought that Jesus is coming in. If he's Messiah, he's going to come in to kick the crap out of these Romans who've kicked the crap out of us, and we're now going to set up God's kingdom here on earth. Except he doesn't, again, he does things a little differently, but it all takes the shape from here in Samuel and the expectations there. And so with Israel's first king, Saul, and then later with David, that there's usually some of the imagery that, or usually some of the contrast, though there's quite a bit, but that Saul and David are radically different. And for all their differences, there are a lot of similarities as well. That both Saul and David begin in triumph and end in tragedy. But that with Israel's first choice, he's tall, dark, and handsome. The Chris Evans of his day. Everything you'd expect a king, everything you want a leader to be. And again, this is just an aside, but I brought this up before, but I'll bring it up again. There's no substitute for character. No amount of gifting that's substitute for character. And you see that especially with Saul. He came up with Samson, but again with Saul, the same kind of idea. There's no substitute. Because later on in Saul's life, though he is chosen by the people, he grows impatient, waiting for Samuel to bless him. And so what does he do? He plays priest himself, and in trying to seek God's blessing, he actually ends up forfeiting it. And this will come up a lot and has been the case since Genesis, where humans who use power or use their power for selfish gain end up, again, ends up bringing them to some kind of ruin. It happens with Adam and Eve in the garden, when the power available to them to eat of anything in the garden but just don't eat from the tree. And what do? They end up making their own rules and they take from the tree. Happens again with Moses, again, when he decides to strike the rock instead of speaking to it. It happens a lot in Judges, and it happens here with Saul. But sadly enough, the same thing happens with David. That it's important to keep in mind what kind of undoing happens, what kind of ruin happens when humans decide to utilize their power for their own selfish gain or own selfish interests. That there's much ruin that happens when humans decide, hey, I'm just going to do what I want, however I want to do it. And so God wants an under king who enhances and facilitates his own rule. I don't know what's going on right there. So are there any questions, comments, concerns so far? And so I'm not going to have you guys read through some of the similarities and differences between what's going on with Saul and then what's going on with David. But after Saul is rejected, we do see what happens between David's being anointing as king and God's choosing a man after his own heart. Without looking here, how have you heard the description of a man after God's own heart, if you've heard that before? How have you heard that described to you guys as?
Yeah. I mean, you hear it a lot in the church and books and different things. You want us to explain like what it means, more or less, what we think it means?
Yeah, what have you heard it described as?
Well, I heard it described as like, like David was a man that even though he did make mistakes and along his lifetime he slept with Bathsheba and did all kinds of crazy things, at the end of his life, God still said that he's a man after my own heart. And so that it kind of like sums up like he always his main goal, his main focus was to always please God, even despite his shortcomings. And he always wanted what God wanted, and he always repented. And so Saul never really repented like the way David did. And so it showed that he did have like God's heart despite his shortcomings, kind of in a sense. That's what.
For sure. And how have others heard it being described as? Or how have you understood the phrase?
I understood the phrase like David's always chasing after God.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's like running after God's own heart. He keeps trying to pursue God in some of the things he does.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, and that's usually what it gets a lot of what it usually gets taken as. Is that we kind of take that being after his heart. Because usually what does heart mean for us?
Intent.
Intent, yeah. What else? Listen to your heart. Go with your heart.
Your gut.
Your gut, yep. The kid's got a lot of heart. Usually we also kind of take it to be like passion, desire.
Desire, yeah.
Yeah. Desire. And that's...
And you say attitude as well?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, anything kind of coming from the human towards another individual that or you usually think like very fondness, like, oh, that it's a when you see somebody doing something like, oh, they're after my own heart, like either niece, nephew, whatever it might be, like they're just either they're just like you or they do the things that you approve of, which you think well of. But again, usually this is a product of modernity, and though there's places to talk about the kind of passion and desire we ought to have for God, namely in the way that we love God, that this isn't a passionless following of Jesus. But again, usually for us, we take it that it's usually love, passionate love, and being a person that David passionately loved God. He was out there playing his harp with the sheep and singing all these psalms and singing all these songs, which may be true. But what it means, specifically in an ancient Near Eastern context, that the heart is the center of the person. And that's where the way all the intellect, everything was there, and that's where you made your decisions. And so to be a man, a person after God's own heart, means that God chose David. That God chose David. Again, it's a funky way of how it's being said, but it's a common way of understanding the ancient Near East, that to be a person after their own heart, again, that's a person whom I have chosen. They're after my heart. And so essentially, if you want to think about it like this, that when God sees David, he's like, that's my dude. That's my boy. You're my boy, Blue. Anybody seen Old School? No, everybody's shaking heads. Oh, come on. No, okay, usually like one person seen it, just random movie. Super funny, but again, that in being a person after God's own heart means that David has been chosen. And again, there's places for passion, there's places for that, but in specific regards to what's happening here with David and in the passage, that it has to do with being chosen by God. Are there any questions, comments, concerns about that? Anybody theology's falling apart because of that? Again, I know usually this is a different way of thinking of it for most people, that it's not just it's not just kind of this one-time deal. It's not just about passion, but really about how God's chosen somebody. And again, it'll come up later on with Jesus, and I'll bring this up again later on with this is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased. All right. Well, let's go ahead. We'll continue to talk about it. So what David does provide for us in his story, and I'll talk about it more when we talk about Solomon, because there's going to be things with Solomon that carry over from David, that David will become the standard of good kingship because of the fact that he's faithful to covenant. That the reason why David is the standard of kingship is because of his faithfulness. It's not because of his charisma. It's not because of his ability to kill Goliaths and to lead Israel into military battle. Again, those are byproducts of David's fulfillment of his, again, fulfilling the requirements of his job, of his duty, which is, again, to lead the people in covenant faithfulness. All the extra stuff that comes along with that is a byproduct of what's going on here with David, of keeping covenant faithfulness. And so giftedness, both David's and otherwise, doesn't mean calling. It's God who chooses. And that when David leads the people into covenant faithfulness, it goes well. And the time that he doesn't, chaos ensues. Which again, what happens, especially in the Bathsheba incident, and I'll talk about it again on Friday, I'll pick it back up, is that to see in the Bathsheba incident the way that David wields his power. Because we see a few chapters earlier in the way David uses power, I believe it's chapter 10 or chapter 11 with Mephibosheth, that you're going to see David wield power for good, that he uses it to help a crippled man and brings him in and takes care of him for the duration of his life. But with Bathsheba, what David chooses to do with this power is that he chooses to be coercive and to work towards his own ends. Again, selfish gain. And this is what gets David in trouble, and that will continue to be a pattern, and again, has been a continual pattern from Genesis of what human beings do with the power that is allotted to them, and whether or not they will choose to be a reflection of God or choose to use their power for selfish gain or selfish means. And so again, even with David, with Israel's greatest king, that even he isn't able to fight off the human temptation to wield power for his own purposes. And so again, keep this in mind as we get over to the Gospels, especially with Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. And to see in different places how Jesus is being tempted to use and wield power for his own purposes. Turn these rocks into bread. Call down angels to save you. If you just bow down and worship, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. And how Jesus over and over again chooses to relinquish power, to not take it up for himself, but instead releases it. Again, which ought to reframe the way we think about leadership, the way we think about ministry, the way we think about life in general, the way we think about being students, big brothers, big sisters, big cousins, aunties, uncles, parents eventually. It just changes so much the way we view things. And when we are in positions of leadership or influence, and what we choose to do with those things, are we operating as people that use our influence, our power for good, or do we just wield it for selfish purposes and to try to procure something that we either desire selfishly or that because of insecurities that we have. And so again, I find myself often in the same place where, because, and part of it, again, to kind of open up the guts here, even though we have a few minutes left, but again, we'll continue it on Friday, that one of the things that I absolutely hate and despise is rejection and abandonment. And so if there's anything I can do to be able to secure from being hurt in that way, that's what I end up doing. And so it's taken a lot of counseling to get through a lot of those things. It's taken a lot of discussions, talks with people, and talk with friends, and opening up, just again, that relationships don't just become objects of manipulation in order to protect and keep myself safe, or what I feel to keep myself safe. And so what a lot of us can do, again, is that's what happens with relationships. And yeah, a lot of leaders have gotten themselves into trouble because of certain issues that they had that manifested themselves in the way that they deal with relationships and the way that they deal with people. And so are there any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns about that? Again, it's going to be something to note in the text, but then also within our own lives. Or the ways that in which we, our relationship with power, our relationship with influence ourselves, and in the way that we use it for good, and the way that we use it for not so good. And that goes down even just the practicalities of how we use money. That, again, a lot of us don't have a ton of it, or much of it at all, being in college. That feeling like, well, just I don't have a lot of that. What are you talking about, Partita? But again, even with the way that we use our money, that's a difficult part for me, is just to make sure that, again, from food to clothing, that how much can I do to at least try to be ethical, that I'm wielding power for good, even if it means where I choose to spend money. Thoughts, questions, comments? Again, I know we only got a couple minutes, but again, I'll bring this back up again on Friday, because again, it comes up with Solomon.
So,
Go ahead.
what you try, in other words, like, in the difference between Saul and David was kind of like that was one of the underlying conditions between them.
That's not just one of the differences, it's one of the similarities between the two. Is that, I mean, David's good streak, his win streak lasts a little longer, but ultimately what they do are similar things. Is that Saul wields his power out of insecurity and tries to kill David. David wields his power out of whether it's just pure desire. He sees a woman bathing on a rooftop. He says, I want that, give it to me. Not just that, because it's not just that, he also has her husband killed because he wants to cover it up. And so again, how David power.
Says God's covenant is what kind of like drew him closer, or kind of like put him in a different place, right? In a sense.
Yeah. I see, and that's part of what differentiates it, is that David is more explicitly loyal, but that David does have this occasion where he himself succumbs to using power for selfish purposes. And so again, while Saul is just more apparent because it's just all over him. Almost from the jump, he wants to go get David. But David kind of has this slow descent after the Bathsheba incident. It just kind of all explodes. But the issues that are present for Saul are likewise present for David. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and pick this back up on Friday. Again, you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out, email me. I'm also available tomorrow, Thursday on Zoom. You guys have the link there in Moodle for office hours from 2 to 4. If you guys need anything, let me know. But yeah, you guys have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
All right. Welcome.